Good morning all and welcome to our panel discussion on the initial thoughts of the budget speech 2022. With us here today, we have Rafael Aloisio and Chris Barch, who will be discussing the economic measures. We also have Caroline Casarino with us, who will be discussing the social measures. Craig Schembri will be discussing on fiscal and tax measures, and also be discussing some of the sustainability measures. Before we kick off, we'd like to share with you the budget highlights video, which was released yesterday. It gives a very good overview of some of the measures which were released yesterday. The idea of the panel discussion today is more to discuss our thoughts on those measures as opposed to go to the measures in detail. So we thought it would be useful to first start off by sharing the video with you. Enjoy. Good evening and welcome to the special episode of Deloitte Let's Talk. We will be covering the key elements and points of interest from the 2022 budget speech. Setting the stage with our economic overview. It has been a very challenging 18 months. The outlook for 2022, as expected, remains conditioned by the unavoidable challenges of COVID-19, as Malta, not to mention the rest of the world, looks to get back on its feet. Although the government is predicting economic growth of 6% in the coming financial year, the recovery of Malta's tourism sector is likely to take longer than that and will be heavily dependent on the apprehension to travel of prospective tourists worldwide. Inflation is expected to be another challenge, hitting 1.7% as a result of higher international energy prices, increased logistical costs, and increased food prices, and also the COVID-induced deficit is expected to push government debt up to 66% of GDP in the coming year. This year's budget clearly aims to anticipate the worst of the fallout by redirecting resources to stimulate fresh business through a series of socially conscious measures. This might also be taken as an indication of the government's desire to push on from temporary COVID lifelines and settle back into incremental but permanent quality of life improvements. To mention a few, all pensioners will receive an increase of €260 per year. Student stipends have been increased by 10% and will also be made available to students working part-time. The bonus for newborn or adopted babies will go up from €300 to €400, and the current free childcare services will be extended for the foreseeable future. Another measure of very considerable social and infrastructural impact is the government's commitment to introduce free public transport for all residents as from 1st October 2022. The focus on sustainability continues with an increase in grants for the purchase of electric or hybrid vehicles, going up from €8,000 to €11,000 or €12,000 when used in conjunction with the vehicle scrappage scheme. Also, 1,200 new charging ports are to be installed across the country. From a fiscal and tax standpoint, the headline is the reduction of the part-time income tax rate from 15% to 10%. There will be effective tax reductions for those with basic salaries under €20,000, a COLA increase of €1.75 weekly, and the existing in-work benefit scheme has been extended to cover more families with working parents. The annual tax refund checks will also be back as well, now increased to a range of €60 to €140, and also qualifying donations on certain business transfers by parents to their children will continue to benefit from a reduced stamp duty rate of 1.5%. There was also space for property-related measures. An exemption on stamp duty and property transfer tax has been introduced on certain properties located in urban conservation areas, capped at €750,000 with related grants for restoration and first-time buyers. Other culturally relevant measures include the allocation of new green spaces, a €20 million investment on afforestation, and a vote of confidence in the Maltese sporting sector with the development of a new Olympic-sized swimming pool, new gymnastic and rowing facilities, and also a new motor track. That wraps up our brief summary of the 2022 budget speech, and we've barely scratched the surface. For those of you looking for more insight into this year's budget speech, we'll be holding a panel discussion live on Zoom tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. To register, please click on the link below. All that's left is to thank you for joining the Deloitte Malta team on Budget Night, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. So we're back. Before we get started with the questions, I'd just like to highlight that we will be answering question and answers as we go along. We'll be answering questions and answering them as we go along. So if you have any questions, there is a Q&A function, and you can just post your questions there and we'll address them throughout the session. So let's get started. I'll start off with you, Chris. Can you briefly explain Malta's economic and financial landscape for the next few years?
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Rachel, for your question. And I would like to give the good morning to all our viewers. Basically, the economic backdrop during which this year's budget was announced should be analyzed within the context of the economic performance. One of the key performance indicators is the GDP, where compared to last year, the GDP, we had a decline and a slowdown in growth as a result of the effects on the pandemic. The growth shrunk by 8.3% in 2020, and this year is expected to recover to 5%. As a way forward, economic growth is expected to increase to 6% next year, and going forward is going to remain stable more or less at 5%. Most of the growth is explained by the aggregate demand, namely through private consumption, which next year is expected to increase in the region of 4%, together with high investment, mainly coming from the private sector, together with government, coupled with net export improvement in net export, which is mainly explained by higher exports and higher proceeds from tourism. The main challenging variable in this context is inflation, as you rightly pointed out in the video, where inflationary pressures, although this year are expected to be in the region of 0.5% when it comes to the HICP, next year, the inflation is going to hit 1.7%, and the following year would be 1.8%. Mainly, there are a lot of dynamic changes going on in the international context. Mainly, there is a surge in international energy prices, together with increase in bottlenecks when it comes to supply side chains and increasing costs when it comes to logistics. Recently, we have seen the surge in prices when it comes to food prices in the region of 3%. So that will be another important aspect to look forward during the course of next year, because definitely if it spill over on other sectors, it dents the competitiveness in general. Going on to employment remained very resilient, even during the pandemic, despite the challenges that we have been going through. The measures implemented by government when it comes to incentive schemes and the tune of wage support measures, coupled with business incentives and assistance to remain afloat, the employment levels remained relatively stable. Growth this year was expected to be 1%, and next year is going to increase as well significantly to 2% and 3% the following years. So employment levels remain resilient, and when it comes to unemployment, even at this point in time, unemployment rate is below the national level of unemployment, which is 3.9%. Usually benchmark with the 4% when it comes to unemployment levels. So labor market is still showing good signs of resilience and is expected to improve. When it comes to the public finances during the past 2 years recorded a negative balance, that is a deficit to the tune of 3 billion euro. Last year, it was 1.5 billion euro deficit. When it comes to percentage of GDP, it was more or less 9%. And this year is going to marginally increase to 11% of GDP. All this is explained by the hefty expense incurred on assistance program in order to weather the storm related to the pandemic. Going forward, the deficit when it comes to explained by the revenues have picked up compared to 2020, mainly through a recovery in economic activity. When it comes to the current expenditure, this year are expected to continue at par with last year's level, as a result that the wage support measures are going to persist by the end of this year. Going forward, the recurrent expenditure is expected to be within check, together with interest payments, because interest payments are expected as well to be in the region of 180 million per year. Interest rates are expected to be stable. So despite the fact that debt levels, the stock of debt levels are expected to increase, the fact that interest rates are going to remain stable in the medium term, there is not much expected an increase on expense when it comes to interest. Capital expenditure is an important aspect as well, because going forward, although this year and next year we're seeing a negative level or a recurrent deficit when it comes to the overall balance. As a way forward, we're seeing that most of this deficit will be explained by the capital expenditure. So by 2024, the deficit will be explained by capital expenditure. In economic terms, the capital expenditure, we refer to it as an investment. So it's imperative that the expense that is going to be spent in capital expenditure will yield value added to the economy, economic value added, and possibly a rate of return, because otherwise the balance will remain structural when it comes to going forward. Last but not least, the debt levels had significantly increased during the past years, basically to finance the deficit. When it comes to debt levels, they are in the region of 60-61% of GDP. Going forward, they are expected to remain the same, despite the fact that the GDP levels, the stock of debt levels is expected to increase to in the tune of €2 billion.
Thank you, Chris. If I may, and just another question. In your views, what are the main policy strengths of this year's budget?
The main policy strengths, basically keeping the social measure aside, which I assume my colleague is going to touch upon, because it was a very good budget when it comes to directing incentives and measures in order to redistribute the well-being generated from a social perspective. I think, in my opinion, the best policy tool which was announced in the budget was related to human capital, because in economic terms, human capital is one of the important and key factors of production in the economy. And this budget is acknowledging that the human capital is imperative that we improve the skills and reskilling of the labor market in general, which I assume that Caroline is going to touch upon that aspect as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Rafael, I'll move on to you. How, in your view, has the budget, this year's budget, aims to assist the economy towards a full recovery? And more importantly, again, in your view, what are any gaps which have not been sufficiently addressed?
Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to discuss the budget. Picking up on some of Chris's points, I think it's important to say that the pandemic obviously has had a very significant impact on the not only on government's finances, but also on the business sector. I think in many respects it has created challenges in various areas. But I believe that also an analysis of the results for 2021 also bring up some positive aspects, which I think before going into sort of the measures which have been taken to address the more impacted sectors, I believe running through the historic results for 2021 is important. Clearly, a positive was the gaming sector, which we all know has been and remains a very important pillar of the local economy. It is encouraging to see that during 2021, the gaming sector has continued to register growth with a 17% increase in activity in this important sector to our economy. Directly related and also in line with the sort of the digital transformation that we're seeing, there's been a significant spike also in the information and communication sectors, which have grown by 12%, another strong performing sector. In 2021, the financial service sector, despite a number of challenges which were becoming increasingly apparent regarding the global fiscal environment, the local financial sector was hit, grew by 10%. Clearly, one of the issues which is also features in the budget is the outlook moving forward, that obviously the grey listing and the repercussions that this will have on this important sector to the local economy, which obviously is under increased pressure. So obviously maintaining the level of growth that we saw in 2021 will be a challenge, and we're already seeing this pressure impacting a number of operators who obviously are having to adjust to the current realities. In this respect, it is positive to note the fact that in this budget, the government has given importance to the fact that we need to rethink our strategy in this sector. Clearly, the world and the environment is changing, and the need for Malta to come up with new strategies and initiatives in this space, not only to safeguard what we have achieved over the years, but also to continue to allow this important sector to be one of our growth pillars. Clearly, another important sector in Malta is the public sector, which in 2021 registered 9% growth. Here, obviously, I think in many respects, it's a bit of a walking a tightrope, in that whilst it is positive to see the public sector continuing to broaden its scope and its penetration in certain activities, it is also a matter of concern sometimes when obviously we see the public sector workforce increasing at certain levels. Clearly, in Malta, where we all know that the availability of people is challenging, it is a concern in certain respects to see a bit of a tug of war between the public sector and the private sector, who are fighting for key limited resources. So as Chris said, the measures being taken to try to reskill and re-nurture certain skill sets in the sector is important. And we also feel that obviously the government, whilst continuing to focus on enhancing its services, needs to be conscious that increasing government payroll has recurring pressures on the economy. And if we look at the forward-looking estimates of the government, where the level of recurrent expenditure is increasing and maintaining itself at a higher level, I would say, particularly driven by the increase in payroll costs within the government. Clearly, this is a challenge that we need to remain eyes open and feet on the ground to ensure that we have a model which remains sustainable. 2021 saw the construction industry obviously maintaining positive growth, and together with the real estate sector achieved a level of 4% growth. It is important that this sector does remain strong and resilient. What we also is positive to know that the strategy in this area is to try to create a healthy balance between the environment, sustainability, and construction. There's a lot of measures which are actually trying to direct investment in construction, not simply in traditional apartment developments, but is putting a lot of focus and emphasis on regeneration of old buildings, and obviously trying to preserve, I think, a more sustainable balance between the importance of construction, social housing, but also sustainable developments. On the negative side, I think I'll be saying the obvious, where we know that the tourism industry has been brought to its knees. Many players have actually had to withstand 18 months of immense pressure. It is positive to note that come June of this year, when travel connections open up, the bounce back has been positive and continues to be positive. But obviously, driving tourism numbers is not simply dependent on initiatives and action taken locally, but also is impacted by the propensity for people feeling safe to travel and to come to Malta. We know that 75%, that is in 2021, tourism operators operated at minus 75% below 2019 level. The impact on the tourism sector obviously had a drip down effect also onto all those sectors which service the hospitality sector, some of which have been hit up to 25–30%. So clearly, this sector, which is one of the local pillars, is still in challenging environment, but the measures being taken, the government has indicated it is intention to continue to support these measures, these sectors, and obviously not to help them to recover. What we possibly might ask for is more insight as to how these measures will translate. Obviously, we know that this is a very dynamic situation, and that these aids and support will evolve over time. But clearly, we really need to have clarity in how these sectors are going to sort of regenerate themselves. Another positive feature that came out of the budget is obviously reference to growth sectors, which it would sort of reading between the lines would appear to be sort of government's motivation to create new areas of activity to support our existing pillars. Reference was made to obviously the esports and gaming sector, which I do believe could be a very significant growth area for Malta over the coming years. The very ambitious maritime expansion plans, obviously linked to the regeneration program for the Grand Harbour, Malta's crown jewel. If this project and this sector are given the importance that they require, I think it could definitely become a new pillar of growth to complement the other sectors. We're seeing the budget continues to support the film industry, which appears to be sort of in a resurgence mode. And clearly, in line with what is happening in many economies, government is clearly giving a lot of importance to startup digital companies and areas linked and activities linked to innovation and development. So I do believe that the budget has addressed a number of these economic dynamics, and I think that in many respects, notwithstanding the devastating impact of COVID, you know, I think there are certain key fundamentals which have withstood the challenges, and I think the opportunities moving forward are there. And I think now it is for us to try to develop these with all stakeholders playing together to try to regain the momentum and return to a stronger economic balance sheet.
That was exactly going to be my question, Rayfil. I mean, you've touched upon some of the future projections for some of the main industries, but if you had to look at some of those main industries, what would you think is the economic vision for some of those, be it tourism, manufacturing, financial services?
I believe that the strategy can be summed up, Raish, on ensuring that the existing pillars are sustained. They are all key. I don't think any of the economic pillars are dispensable. I think it is important that we continue to sustain these sectors. We continue to sort of learn from what has hit us and try to sort of end up with a better product. So I don't think we should be simply aspiring to do what we did before, but we should be looking at learning from the experiences over the last couple of years, be them in the tourism sector and also in the financial sector and the grey listing impact, and to sort of come up with a better product which is more in tune with the current realities. I think tourism should not focus simply on volume, but as everybody is saying, we should move to a improved product and higher quality. And I sort of summarize it trying to do more with less, as opposed to simply going for volume. But I do believe that given the massive success that Malta achieved in the gaming sector, it is a known fact that esports and gaming is the new thing for the future. I think we have a lot of fundamentals already in place. And I think coming up with a strategy of how we can become leaders in this space. We've done it in gaming, so I don't see why we can't also do it in esports, which possibly has less connotation with gaming, but more on technology and entertainment, and is also a direct link with our tourism product. When it comes to the Grand Harbour, the regeneration and maritime, Malta has always been a maritime hub, center of the Mediterranean. I believe that even with the relaunching of Libya in the future, I think the opportunities in the maritime, even oil and gas areas, are going to be very significant. And if we can, over the next 10 years, really deliver on the Grand Harbour regeneration, I think that we could have a unique feature which would put us, I think, not only in the tourism sector, but also in the logistics and transportation sector, I think in a position where very few other jurisdictions will be able to compete with us. So I do believe that the sectors have been identified. I wish there was more detail as to how we are going to achieve it, but I think the appeal would be, let us try to get the stakeholders to work together to come up with something which together, we can rebuild these pillars and growth areas for the economy.
We'll move on to social measures. There haven't been any questions yet, so just a reminder that if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address them. So I'm going to move on to the social measures. As we've already pointed out, social measures have been very topical in this year's budget. And here I'll ask you a question, Caroline. There have been quite a lot of measures relating to students, relating to talent. Why, in your view, has this been the case this year?
Hi, first of all, good morning, and thank you for having me here this morning, and good morning, everyone. Rach, as we discussed last night, as we sat and we listened to the measures being announced, really the focus, there has been an immensely strong focus on talent. And I think any employer this morning reading the highlights and reading and understanding and absorbing all that information that's been shared can really, want to understand the search for talent and the struggle that is faced by many organizations locally in terms of finding people, and the impact that this is having on its business coming out of 18-month long, COVID pandemic that has left organizations having to rethink basically the very essence of how they work and how this has impacted people. So looking at the measures that were announced and understanding, okay, so when we saw the students and the impact on the stipends, we've seen measures such as the ability to have more access to areas like childcare and having that flexibility. We've seen impact on things like, for example, the reduction on the tax on the extra hours. What I'm curious to see as well is to understand more, okay, as an employer, what are all these measures, what is the overall impact going to be on the employer? So with students being available to work more, increasing the number of hours available to be in the workforce, clearly, how does this marry with the impact that employers are seeing in respect of that shortage of talent that everybody's is speaking about across various industries? I think possibly looking forward to sort of seeing, okay, what next? How are these measures going to impact? I think we can clearly see that there has been a strong push for driving increased activity within the workforce. And the challenge now becomes, we've all experienced the ability to have a remote working force. And how does this, in terms of flexibility, in terms of ability to work how we want, in terms of the ability to manage our working day better, in terms of sort of having that combination of what the employee is looking for versus what the employer needs. So this is really where we're seeing, Rach, sort of this drive to really, by the government, to make sure that they have put in place measures that will continue to trigger this activity. We also see in terms of the categorization of the stipends by the course type as well, in terms of I'd like to understand more in terms of how this is going to impact sort of, which are the industries that are requiring the most skills, and the retraining of those skills, and pushing to make those specific courses more attractive in terms of pushing students to select. So the STEM subjects themselves, we recognize that this remains a challenge in terms of students wanting to pursue these specific areas. So how will these measures ultimately impact and alleviate the challenges found by employers at the moment? Still yet to be seen. I think what is also interesting from an employer perspective is, as the government has just made maybe a bit of noise till now, and hasn't really started, but the conversations around, we look outside of Malta, and we're starting to see conversations around 4-day weeks, some countries actually introducing it. How does this marry with the concept of, increasing workforce, challenging work, and then how do we marry this with the introduction of a reduced working week, and how does that impact on business?
And I think you've touched upon, there's quite a lot of points, and we've discussed this in quite a lot of detail, but there's also been an increased focus on workers and encouraging work, a lot of focus on education,
Yes.
as Rachel mentioned, startups, apprenticeships. So they seem to be pushing and encouraging. This is all as a result of what we've been through the past 18 months, I would assume.
Indeed. The focus was very clearly, within the human capital space, there was a lot of emphasis on the apprenticeship and the importance of having that right forum for students to be able to be out in the workplace, to be able to be experiencing and obtaining that real life experience to apply to their studies, so that when industry receives these students, when you're growing your workforce, that you have had this exposure. And it's not only just in the apprenticeship schemes, right? It's also been in terms of strengthening and making sure that the education system gets the focus it needs, in improving on the educators themselves. We're seeing measures in terms of university, MCAS, the Institute of Education, all merging together to work towards strengthening this. And again, I believe it really ties into sort of, the future and the war, if you like, on talent, and sort of how ready is Malta going to be from a perspective of making sure that the education system is aligning with the needs of the business. Today, we recognize, we see students sometimes struggling, that what they're learning in school might not necessarily be applicable to what they find when they join the working world in some specific industries. So there has been a welcome sort of measure in terms of strengthening this and continuing to focus on this. One point which I found interesting was the introduction of the O-levels being placed sort of in the actual school, as opposed to sort of examination halls, as we all know, as we all went through, but maybe not so much. So for me, it touched slightly on the whole concept of sort of the mental well-being, and sort of the, how has that impacted employees. But I was a bit surprised that it didn't go much further than that, because I think that is possibly a space where, where we speak about well-being, we speak about the importance of how important it is to have that space and give it that importance. Yet I felt, we're barely scratching the surface still.
I think I do agree with you. They focus a lot on the employee, on the students, and I think the employer in its own right was a bit neglected, so to say.
As an employer, today we are what are the issues? If you speak to the people on the panel, I'm sure many would agree. What are the issues that you're suddenly faced with? The costs, the incurring costs, and the exorbitant costs that COVID has brought to an organization. So today, an employer is bearing the cost of unvaccinated staff who have to quarantine. So depending on the nature of your business, that is a huge cost in terms of opportunity cost, in terms of productivity, in terms of the expenses you're bearing. Remote working, when you have people working from home, it's still additional costs. How are businesses going to be supported in terms of how does one carry on its operation without the necessary support, in terms of not always being able to have all those resources available. The truth is, COVID has forced organizations to rethink their HR models, their transformation of, maybe going from an HR function that is purely driven by data and processing to really having to, up its game, be more of a value-added partner, and really make sure that, you have the required measures and you have a good understanding of the impact of COVID on your business, while still keeping your business open for business.
Yeah, and I think, again, another important point was the future of the workforce. So the workforce we knew pre-COVID is very different to the workforce now and the workforce we will expect to see in the future. And I think that the government made a very important statement around the green and the digital transformation.
For sure. And in fact, the minister, you know, actually said it's a race against time. And I think Malta really needs to you know, have its skates on, because really at the moment we see there are so many changes happening. We have workforces that have experienced the option to have more control of their working life and more control of the way they manage their day and their time, and still yet deliver. And we cannot undermine the importance of and the impact that has had on working life, and it will never be the same. And you know, I mean, Minister yesterday ended by saying, listen, it's a race against time, especially in terms of the green agenda and even in terms of the digital and even, you know, processes. There was reference made to the improvement of the third country national process with Identity Malta being improved as well. I mean, these are key. If Malta is to retain and to keep up and to be able to manage to keep, you know, recruiting and going through these processes and without hampering the day-to-day business of the organization to be able to continue, then it is key that the government steps up and makes sure that these processes continue to make Malta look as an attractive country and, you know, a meaningful destination for somebody to come and build their career if the government continues to attract and employ third country nationals.
Thank you for that, Ken. I think that leads me to kind of sustainability, which was obviously another area which was very topical in yesterday's budget. I think businesses have been placed under increasing pressure to address ESG concerns within their businesses. This comes as a result of the 2020 EU long-term plan around achieving climate neutrality by 2050, and that was a new goal which the EU issued in 2020, and ever since we haven't stopped hearing about sustainability, and rightly so. It's putting companies under a lot of pressure, it's putting individuals under a lot of pressure, because there is a lot that needs to be done with respect to sustainability. Earlier this year, Malta submitted a Recovery and Resilience Plan to the European Commission, which was actually approved earlier on in September by the European Commission, as a result of which Malta will be granted funds of just over 316 million. Most of those funds have been allocated to a lot of measures around sustainability. This was referred to yesterday in the budget speech, but again, we didn't expect much detail there, because obviously the resilience plan was submitted to the European Commission, and those will be the points which will be implemented going forward. We did, however, see environmental sustainability measures which were at the heart on all other measures to do with transport, infrastructure. They were all driven by sustainability. I think another thing important to mention in this respect when it comes to sustainability, that we've seen a strong push, and it was evident yesterday in the speech as well, towards facilitating green projects. Earlier this year, there was the inclusion of the green bonds list on the Malta Stock Exchange, and there was also the MDB tailored facility to assist SMEs, which has been extended to finance green projects, also in the private sector. Rafe, a few comments from you, especially on this MDB facility.
I think clearly anything to do with sustainability and environmentally sustainable projects is going to be at the heart of a lot of projects. I think a lot of developers and businesses are going to sort of have to find ways of incorporating these sustainability. The fact that there is going to be funding and incentives to support these type of projects obviously will try to allow these investments to become more sort of viable even in the short term. Obviously, there is the fundamental motive behind it, you know, to do the right thing in the right way. But obviously, the financial considerations have to be factored in, and these type of incentives, which I expect to continue to grow over the years, will continue to sort of, like has happened in other countries, will continue, I think, to come up high in the agenda of many businesses in sort of the way they will rethink what they do and how they do it.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll move on to Craig. Obviously, we can't not mention the fiscal and the tax measures which were announced yesterday. I think although nothing new and things which we expected and lots of extensions, etc., obviously still worth a mention, and they are extensions which the population expects, I would say, at this point.
So, thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. I think in terms of budget, I would say this budget ticks a number of boxes on a number of levels. First of all, to me, this is the first budget in what we hope to be a post-COVID economic recovery period. And in fact, there are a number of initiatives to let's say, boost up and enhance economic growth, sustainable economic growth. It is also the first budget post FATF grey listing. So as we go along, we'll definitely see a number of let's say, fiscal rules coming into play to address certain concerns highlighted in the FATF report. Tax has been one of the areas of focus, so definitely to watch the space there. It's also fair to say that it is perhaps the last budget in this legislature. And also ESG, okay, environment, social and governance is also front and center. I think overall, this has been quite a balanced budget. As Rachel mentioned, perhaps first of all, there are no new taxes. It's more perhaps some new additions, some new rules coming in, and perhaps tweaking or extensions of measures which have been previously announced in other budgets. It's also some of the forces which I just mentioned, they tend to be a bit opposing. On one hand, one is a stimulus to economic growth and provision of grants and incentives to businesses and also to individuals, particularly in view of the inflation, which Chris mentioned earlier. At the same time, obviously, in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's important for government to obviously secure and retain focus on revenue collection. If I had to focus a bit on some of the key fiscal measures, I think there was a focus on pensions, okay, in the extension and the increase in the rate of pensions that will be exempt. It's in the region of 14,300, and for pensioners who adopt the joint tax computation, there is an additional 3,600 of other income, which will also be exempt. Over the next couple of years, there will also be a measure for pensioners to essentially exclude their pension income from the computation of taxable income, and therefore there will be a compounding effect in the sense that other income will start to be taxed at a lower rate. There is over and above the 175 weekly COLA adjustment, there is an additional 325 for persons in receipt of social security pensions, which obviously will up to €5 a week. There was also obviously other measures related to property. I mean, property is always a focal point in any budget. I think a new measure that has been announced is a 50% reduction on the tax levied on the first 200,000 of value on transfers of property that are rented to tenants that fall within eligible to housing authority schemes. And if the transfer of the property is affected to the actual tenant, there is a tax and duty exemption. There is also an exemption on the first 750,000 of value on property transfers for properties that are in a UCA or properties that have been constructed more than 20 years ago and vacant for at least 7 years, or properties which have certain architectural and traditional features. In addition to the exemption, buyers will also be eligible to a grant of up to 15,000 and 30,000 in the case of property in Gozo, and also to a VAT refund on costs up to 300,000, therefore 54,000 in VAT rebate on any cost for restoration and improvement. We've also seen the extension of the first time and second time buyer scheme for Gozo properties. And also another important extension measure that has been extended is the 1.5% reduced duty rate on qualifying donations to descendants. So this applies for transfers of properties within a business property and transfer of shares. This measure has been introduced a number of years ago and has been extended a number of times. It proved to be a very successful measure and an interesting measure for businesses. We all know about the challenges which family-owned business face. So this is at least something which will facilitate transition of businesses across the generations. Other areas of focus, Caroline mentioned the human capital front. And to me, measures focused towards workers have a dual role. First of all, they will obviously promote the human capital side, but also they will increase money in the pocket of particularly lower earners. And here we're talking about overtime, where basically up to 10,000 of overtime income will be taxed at 15%. Part-time rules today, part-time income is taxed at 15%. The rate will go down to 10%. We're also seeing the tax refund, which is available to persons in receipt of income below 60,000. This will go up to a range of 60 to 140 euros. Again, a reduction in the tax rate for cultural income from arts and culture. The rate will be 7.5%. And we're also seeing a number of in-work benefits across a number of let's say, beneficiaries. Another measure, which is a new measure, which is aimed at, let's say, perhaps it's a bit of a COVID-friendly measure, whereby companies can effectively surrender unutilized capital allowances. It's a new measure. Today, we don't have that concept in our tax law. Companies can surrender losses, but this measure will facilitate the surrendering of capital allowances, which is effectively tax depreciation on capital expenditure on a 2-year period. And companies will be eligible to transfer these unutilized capital allowances and offset them against profitable other areas of profitable business. Is this the end of fiscal measures? In my mind, it's not. Obviously, we're living in a very dynamic world, especially when it comes to global tax initiatives. So this...
Yeah, in fact, Greg, that was going to be my next question to you. Although, I mean, it wasn't addressed in yesterday's budget. It's obviously been in the news. We have a lot of talk around Pillar 2, but it's no doubtably going to affect the tax landscape in the future. So I think it's worth a few comments on Pillar 2.
Okay, I'll keep it short and simple.
Yes, please.
Basically, I mean, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are essentially the result of OECD G20 BEPS initiative. And essentially, they're designed to address certain international tax challenges, primarily within the digital space. I think it's fair to say that perhaps it started at a slower pace, but particularly due to the pandemic and perhaps jurisdictions want to boost up the tax revenue collection, the pace has been accelerated. And also widened in scope. To me, what started perhaps as a bit of focus on digital economy is now, particularly through Pillar 2, is now broader in scope. Last week, we've seen a new tax deal which has been agreed amongst essentially 136 jurisdictions, Malta being one of them. All the G20 countries, all the EU member states have basically endorsed this. We've seen Hungary, Ireland, and Estonia being delayed joiners. I think if I had to say, I think Pillar 1 is essentially a mechanism to reallocate profits generated by pretty much the top 100 multinationals. And essentially, the drive is to reallocate profits and tax payments in jurisdictions where these large MNEs operate and generate profits. Pillar 1 has been, in my mind, narrowed in scope. And again, I'll be focusing more on Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is basically the introduction of a minimum tax, 15% tax rate. It is applied for companies with revenues of at least 750 million. And it is expected to see an increase of 150 billion of tax payments across the globe. These pillars are expected to come into force in 2023. There are obviously a number of rules. Obviously, the devil is in the detail. One needs to establish how these rules are going to be implemented locally, and of course, what it means for Malta. I think if I had to sum up the key design of Pillar 2, as I said, the aim is to introduce a minimum tax of 15%. There are two domestic rules, which are basically the income inclusion rule, which will essentially impose a top-up tax up to 15% at the level of the parent company. And on any income which is derived by a constituent entity of the group, which falls below the minimum tax rate, obviously subject to certain complex rules. There is also the undertaxed payment rule, which basically whereby companies will be denied a tax deduction of payments made to let's say interest, royalties, dividend payments made to companies which fall below the minimum tax threshold. And there is also a subject to tax rule, which is essentially designed to in a way alter the concept of tax treaties, and basically introduced a rule whereby jurisdictions will have taxing rights beyond what they have today under existing tax treaties to let's say adjust the tax based on certain payments. There are a number of carve-outs on the Pillar 2. So again, there is first of all the 750 million threshold on revenue. There is also a formulaic approach. So basically, there is some of the profits will fall outside the scope of the minimum tax, and these are typically quantified by reference to tangible assets and payroll. So obviously there will be a drive towards substance. There is also a de minimis carve-out, which basically excludes companies with revenues of less than 10 million and 1 million of profit. What's also interesting is that there is no, let's say, although this is more of an approach and target to address tax competition. So it's not of itself addressing certain companies, let's say, which are compliant from a transfer pricing perspective, will still fall within scope of Pillar 2. How does this and how is this going to impact Malta's jurisdiction? Obviously, don't know the details yet. I think it's fair to say that, I mean, Malta's regime is essentially, there is a rate of 5% which can be availed of by international players, and obviously the Pillar 2 will definitely have an impact. Bear in mind that there is a dual role here. There is the inward and the outward impact. It's not just how Malta is going to tax, let's say, profits, but it's also how other jurisdictions are going to treat payments made to Malta structures. So definitely when one is studying the Malta product, obviously is going to be a relevant feature.
Thank you for that, Craig. There is one question which we've received around the deferred payments of VAT and tax relating to 2020 and 2021, which was a measure which came out during COVID. My understanding is that this has not been extended, and we have no more information at this point as to whether it's going to be extended for 2022. Craig, I don't know if you have any feedback, but
I would
that's
agree with that statement. Basically, I mean, the deferment initiative has been extended a number of times, but so far we don't have any visibility
on 22.
Extending it beyond maybe.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else on the panel has any concluding comments they'd like to pass on to our viewers. Any more questions from our viewers? If not, then thank you very much for joining us. We hope to be able to run a few more sessions in the future and keep you updated with what's happening, especially when the measures start to be implemented. And thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good day.